It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Jesse Ashlock, who will be in turn introduce tonight's panelists. Jesse most recently was the editor-in-chief of the sadly departed I.D. magazine. And before becoming editor-in-chief, Jesse was an I.D. contributing editor and moderated the interactive category for I.D.'s annual design review. Prior to joining the I.D. team, Jesse held editorial posts at Rest Magazine, the Tribeca Film Festival, and V-Man. Please join me in welcoming Jesse.
Hi to all of you. Thanks for coming back after last week was postponed by the weather. This is Design for Humans. I am Jesse Ashlock. I'm no longer at I.D. I'm sort of a rogue agent now. I'll just introduce our distinguished panelists real quickly, and then we can chat amongst ourselves for a while, and then we'll open up the floor for general discussion. So sitting in the middle is Mr. Dan Formosa of Smart Design. He's one of the founders of Smart Design, a global design consultancy established in 1980 on the idea that design should be about people, or humans, if you will, and not about things. He holds his undergraduate degree in product design and also has a PhD in product design and biomechanics. Biomechanics is essentially the mechanical engineering of the body, including things like how our muscles and bones make us move, which plays a key role in Dan's thinking about designing products. And it also means that he's been known to get intimate at times with skeletons. Dan played an integral role in defining and developing the original line of OXO kitchen tools designed to be used by everyone, all humans. Almost 20 years later, that association has led this year, or last year rather, to the introduction of the OXO Cimzia syringe, which makes it possible for patients with rheumatoid arthritis to self-inject their medication at home. His work on the interface for this year's 2010 North American Car of the Year, the 2010 Ford Fusion Hybrid, introduced a radical concept to the automotive industry for saving fuel. And that is this dashboard that you see. For 100 years, instrument clusters have been giving the driver information only about the performance of the car. This one gives the driver information about the performance of the driver as well through those leaves to the side. And by influencing driver behavior, fuel efficiency can be increased by more than 10 miles a gallon. Finally, Cardinal Health Endura Scrubs, which were introduced last year, challenged the paradigm for a product that had degenerated to a low-cost commodity item, which makes many hospital staffers feel cold, exposed, and uncomfortable. These scrubs have been upgraded to the level of performance wear as opposed to the usual cheap pajamas, adding such design innovations as angled pockets, mesh areas for airflow to those hot regions.
Oh, could you talk a little more about that?
I'm going to save that for Dan. Sigi Moeslinger, Antenna Design. You may recognize this. You may have come here on it. She founded Antenna Design with Masamichi Udagawa in 1997. They focus on industrial and interaction design for public and commercial projects, and also occasionally do self-initiated projects, commentary concepts. Some of their earliest projects in the late 90s for the New York subway system, like the subway car and the MTA vending machines, have influenced their subsequent thinking about design and public space. I like this quote of Sigi's, that with some products you can design for certain market segments, but with public space you have to design for people of all ages, abilities, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Their 2004 hardware and interface design for JetBlue's self-service check-in kiosk builds on some of the ideas from the MTA MetroCard machine to create a friendly, welcoming, and above all, intuitive platform for beginning one's trip. In addition to these highly functional designs for public space, Antenna has also created experiential public installations like Power Flower, which was in Bloomingdale's, New York in 2002. It's an audiovisual installation of neon flowers that bloom and make ambient sounds when pedestrians pass by. And similarly, right here in the Cooper-Hewitt in 2003, Antenna did Cherry Blossom, which consisted of a set of surveillance cameras monitoring traffic on the grand staircase upstairs onto a 2-story high semicircle. The more people on the stairs, the more flowers on the projection screen. More recently, Antenna has been designing products for the enterprise market, like this family of IP telephony products from Microsoft. Here they've developed an interactive touchscreen design geared toward much more sophisticated tasks, like managing complex menus and ad hoc conferencing. This was an IDEA Award winner in, was it 2008, Sigi? Yeah. And so is this one, I think. And this one's upstairs in Design USA. It's their latest of several Bloomberg products, Bloomberg Flexible Display, introduced in 2007, and it's meant to accommodate an even greater level of sophistication. Both screens in this ultra-thin dual-screen display can be rotated horizontally or vertically with software that adjusts screen orientation. And last, but most certainly not least, Niels Diffrient. And this is not Niels. But the reason I put this slide the reason I put this slide in was because Niels grew up loving the romance of early aviation and found himself drawing planes constantly. And eventually this habit led him to become an industrial designer. That's all true, right, Niels?
Yeah, as far as it goes.
He went on to spend 25 years at Henry Dreyfuss Associates in New York, designing everything from medical equipment to tractors to airplane interiors. And during this time became deeply invested in better understanding human nature and behavior, human factors, through testing and research. He literally wrote the book on ergonomics. This is the first volume from 1974.
The first, yeah.
Yeah. In 1981, he left to start his own small independent practice focusing on office chairs. This early one, the Jefferson work chair, is really more of a place than a chair, I think it's fair to say. He went on to design the 1999 Freedom Chair for human scale, working on the principle that performance should drive appearance. I'm fond of this quote, "The most satisfying conclusion to what I design comes from people who respond to the product's visual appeal, only to realize later how useful and satisfying they are. It's a lot like marrying a girl for love, and then finding out she has money." His 2004 Liberty Chair, also for human scale, was in many ways the culmination of a career's worth of research in integrating into designing for the human body. It's meant to eliminate all those knobs and levers office chair sitters usually have to fuss with, and by extension to get rid of the need for an instruction manual, because who wants to read an instruction manual to sit in a chair? And upstairs, the Different World Chair, also through human scale, raises the bar for both simplicity and sustainability in task seating, with a design that features just 80 parts, less than a third of comparable chairs, 95% of which can be recycled. And his designs are beloved by everybody from lowly cubicle denizens to the great protector of freedom himself, Mr. Jack Bauer of 24.
Who is he?
Are you sitting on your chair?
No, but who is he? I've never seen him before.
Kiefer Sutherland.
Oh, I thought he was a client.
Why don't we get started with a proposition. Design is, this talk is called Design for Humans. Design is, well, I'm getting louder. Design is fundamentally about creating things for humans. So are we talking about design here, or are we talking about some rarefied subset of design when we talk about design for humans?
Who are you asking?
Would you like to begin?
Me? All design is for humans. Sometimes it's done well, sometimes it's done poorly, but it's all for humans. That's the only thing we know how to do. It has not become much of a focus until the last several decades. When I was working for Henry Dreyfuss starting in 1955, it was a rarity that there was any attention paid to any amount of focus on really what worked for helping people live with products and circumstances. And I give Henry Dreyfuss the credit for having made that more well known. I don't know how many of you know the history of industrial design, and I apologize to those who do, but the founders of the profession, at least those we credit, were 4 people, and Henry was one of them. Raymond Loewy, Walter Teague, and Norman Bell Geddes were the others. There was no industrial design profession before them. In the States, there was some activity in Germany and Europe, but for the States, those 4 people pretty much established what design for mass production was going to be. And Henry took a course which was counter to trends in styling and said that this stuff ought to work for people who use it. And during the Second World War, he found that there was an early effort to understand the nature of people, everything from fitting uniforms to soldiers to fitting them into war machines, airplanes and tanks, and realized that this was the beginning of something that made a lot of sense. And to my knowledge, that was pretty much the origins of a focus with any amount of rigor in the profession.
Would either of you guys care to comment on the idea of, is there a kind of design that is done that is not for humans? I mean, is that just bad design?
Sometimes there is design that's very technology-centric or simply design-centric. It's about the designer and their expression, or in the case of technology-centric, it is a company that has all kinds of special technologies and wants to put everything into one product without ever asking the question, but who is going to use that and how are they going to use it and is it even necessary or useful? And so, yes, ultimately everything is for humans, but sometimes people don't think that way more often than we want to, because if you go out and you look around, you encounter many things where you say, well, what did people think when they did that? Nobody thought how this will be used. So yes, it should be all design should be for humans, yet some people forget that aspect.
I saw a dog the other day wearing a great coat.
But is that coat for the dog or for its owner?
No, definitely for the owner. Dog and coat were one big accessory.
Right. Yeah. Was that just right outside here somewhere?
It was uptown New York City, yeah.
What do you call human factors for dogs? Dog
Canine
factor?
factors.
Canine factor.
Yeah. Do you want to elaborate on that at all from the perspective of the way smart practices?
Oh, yeah, I'll make that connection, sure.
No, not the dogs, the humans.
Oh, well, I've got this whole backlog history of the way we started our office, which goes back to the fact that the people who started our office, we all went to college together and we were born in the 50s, which meant we came up through the baby boom wave of the 60s where there was a lot of radical thinking and student protest and a lot of social issues that were happening in the U.S. in the 50s and the 60s. By the time we got into college, there was student movements and big business was bad, government was bad, computers were bad. Don't laugh, I still feel that way. And any form of authority was bad. So when we got out of college, we and probably everyone else in college with us, no matter what their field was ready to change the world. So we, my feeling was design was not in a great state in the late 1970s. There was very little design research being done. There were Niels mentioned Henry Dreyfuss' office, which was doing some, but in the general public, there was not a lot of concern about the human. It was all about the object. So we started our office with the ideas that we should actually do some homework and get out in the field and talk to people and watch things and focus on the person as opposed to the thing. It was a bit of a radical concept back then. Not totally unprecedented, but it wasn't the norm.
Now, Niels, I think you mentioned earlier the idea that design is a fundamentally human activity. We're all designers.
Well, it's our choice.
So what elevates the design profession? What makes one a professional designer? And what
there
makes
is no
one
profession in design. Design is not a profession. It's an activity.
It's a verb.
Well, fundamentally it's a verb, but when used as a noun, it's pretty dispersed. I mean, I would say that there's as many definitions of design as there are people in this room. Everybody, when I say design, probably has a somewhat different image of it. It's at the far end, on one side is design as related to art. At the far end of the other side is design related to technology. And there's a full range in between. And probably the thing that's most frustrating today is design is figured to be entirely devoted to visual aesthetics. How does a thing look? Virtually everything is judged by its look nowadays. But design applies, as Dan just and Sigi both alluded to, it's a lot more than that. The difference between us as designers and engineers is that engineers are fundamentally without an aesthetic motive. They work out something that functions mechanically or electrically, and it's functional, but they don't add that extra something that's poetic, cultural, visually satisfying. So the real magic of design is when you do something that satisfies a real need for people and then adds that extra something in which it's beautiful or satisfying to use or just to hold. And that's what makes the difference for a designer. But that's not fully understood, especially the side of it which has to do with function or performance. I wonder if anybody could define, I'm not asking for a lot of hands or anything, but if anybody could define what function means. Because there's an old saying in design that design follows function. And I don't have any question that virtually every designer we know would be happy to tell you about the design side of it. But there are not a lot of people who can define what function means. And you know what I mean. The function is an elusive thing that has to do with meeting the needs of people, many times before they even know they need it. And that's not fully understood. And even if you have a sympathy for it, which I think most designers do, there's not a lot of organization in that side of design to be sure that you've satisfied some real need of people and not just a pretend sort of a need. So what was the question?
Oh, it's been so long.
I'll keep it short.
I started out by asking what qualifies somebody to call themselves a professional designer. I mean, obviously you can refer to their diplomas. Yeah. You said, you talked about there is no professional design. Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think following that, I'd like to ask about how broad you have to be a practicing designer.
Just one or two more comments on that. To be a professional, you have to be responsible. You have to be accountable for something. You have to have advanced a theory or a program or an action for which you will stand accountable, because you know from the foundation of your activity that there is a way to measure that accountability. We don't have that in design. Do you think we do? I don't think we do.
Not a lot.
No, well, that sounds like nothing. I don't think we do. How do you measure your accountability? Nobody comes after you, do they?
Well, how do you mean?
Well, there's been some legal action in design, obviously, but it's usually when you're treading on somebody's financial basis or something.
Well, one way is with a consumer product, if people don't like your product, they don't need to buy it. So there is some choice people have in disagreeing with what you have done. Unfortunately, you don't always know that beforehand, that you don't like something. Maybe you think you buy something that you want and that's good, and then you find out it's crap. But still, the bigger picture is, I think, that people have a choice of what they get with consumer products. But then there's this whole world where people don't have a choice, for example, with equipment or in a public realm, where people have to use whatever is given to them. And then this responsibility, I think, becomes even greater because people don't have a choice. They don't have to say, no, I don't want to use your product. Or if you do equipment that people have to use at work, and a chair that they have to sit on, and they don't have a choice. Their employer gave them that chair, and it's painful to sit in. So it's definitely a big responsibility.
Yeah, it is. The thing about what you've said is that the measure of success is mostly sales. But that's the only really numerical count we get on success.
Well, for consumer products, but I mean, if we're talking about the subway or something, then how would you quantify success?
Well, I'd hate to say that it has to do with whether the subway fails or not. They seem to manage to fail it regardless of that. No, that much is another aspect of it.
But you were taking into consideration other factors besides like whether the subway runs or not in terms of thinking about the subway design. And so how would you measure the success of those other things you were taking into consideration?
Well, obviously we cannot really measure them, but there is feedback from the general public as to whether they appreciate or not. It's not in any kind of rigorously measured way, but overall you do hear feedback and also how it has been received by the media, and does it make a difference? And one nice thing is it's actually something that we can use ourselves, so I'm a customer too, or a user, so at least I can see where things work or where they don't.
Yeah, for many of our consumer products, we check Amazon.
And how are they doing
learn
that?
anything from them?
Well, you know, it's very interesting. I heard a discussion a couple of weeks ago on Amazon that, well, many people, I'm sure many people here, when you buy something, you're in the store, where do you go to check whether you should buy something? To the internet, right? And these are probably a lot of professional designers, although I shouldn't say professional. These are probably a lot of designers. But yeah, one of the interesting things that I heard about Amazon is, well, you know, we know a lot of people check Amazon, but I also heard a very interesting story that on Amazon, if there are 200 great reviews and 4 bad reviews, maybe I'll ask them, what do you read? You know, you look at the word 200 and then you read the bad review because you want to be forewarned about what happened. So those few people who are writing a bad review have an amazing amount of power.
Well, Toyota's suffering that right now.
Yeah. So we do read reviews. Sometimes we read reviews just because, you know, people are talking to each other so much. It used to be about big things, like if you're buying a car. But now it's like, you know, $10 things. You know, people are checking out, like, what's the best kitchen item to buy, and people are writing tomes about things like that.
There's a wonderful piece worth reading on Design Observer about the poetics of the amateur Amazon review, and there's a lot of poetry there. I mean, not your kind of ivory tower poetry, but you know, true populist poetry.
About what?
Of the amateur product reviews on Amazon.
Right.
Yeah, and some people really care.
Well, that's of course a vitally interesting question about the average person who makes no pretense of knowing anything about professional design or engineering or anything of that sort, and yet ultimately becomes the arbiter of what we do by what they buy. And so one wonders, you can take the approach of the marketing person and say, well, let's just find out what they buy and then we'll do more of that, right? And then you think, well, they buy a lot of hamburgers too from McDonald's, but you can't exactly measure that as advancing civilization. And then you think, well, what do you do on Sigi's subway cars? You can't measure the purchase price because those folks don't have any choice. If they want to ride underground, they've got to ride the subway. So then you get back to the question of how you handle this in a way that you could call professional. And it brings up the issue of whether you have ways of determining whether you have satisfied the fundamental needs of people: safety, convenience, comfort, just plain enjoyment of things, without waiting until it's done and getting a feedback either through complaints or through purchasing. And this is what I mean about making a profession of it. Now, I know a lot of designers that would like to kick me off the stage for introducing this as a possibility because they feel it will strangle them in their creative urges, that they want to be free to make creations of, that come straight from their libido. And I can understand that. There's satisfaction there, but design.
Are we talking about the hot places now? Have we gotten to the hot places?
I'm working in that direction. Design is not art. Art has no utility. Design is about utility. Design is for things that you can use. You agree?
I do agree, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think use can also be sometimes simply something that delights you.
That what?
That delights you.
Of
that can be the
course,
main
yeah.
function of something.
Yeah.
I was actually on Amazon today reading a review about something we designed, and the review was really simple. It said, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. What else do you want me to say?
Congratulations. I wish all our designs had a review like that.
It seemed that was a good review.
Oh, that's great.
So why don't we go backwards in the design process from the point at which you have consumers evaluating your designs to the point where you're actually coming up with them. You mentioned earlier getting out in the field, you know, in the early 70s. Maybe each of you could talk a little bit about fieldwork methodology and, you know, what you do when you start mapping out what a product is going to become, or, you know, a design is going to become.
So how many hours did you spend on the subway, Sigi, before you did a subway design?
Quite a bit. So yeah, in any case, or in any project, typically we start out with observations. We go out there, we try to understand the context where something is living or is going to live. Meaning, who are the people who are using this? What are their backgrounds, their beliefs, their social status, their level of education? What is the physical environment like? What is the psychological environment like that people are in when they're using this? Is it during leisure time that they're using this, or is it in a stressful situation? So all of these things we try to understand. And but this kind of research is not, how can I say, scientific research. It is really for a very specific purpose, which is to, it allows us to explore and get inspired by what we see and by the people that we meet. We talk to them, sometimes we just observe them, and of course it informs us. And ultimately the goal of the research needs to be that it is useful for what we have to do as a next step. So it's not research for the sake of research, which sometimes seems to happen. Sometimes it's like people have on their checklist research, and then they do something and then they check it off, but their research never feeds into the actual product development, and it's good for nothing. So then as we advance in our sort of conceptual phase and ideation phase, then we sometimes use different techniques such as scenarios and storyboarding. We may make up characters that we use in our scenarios to help us imagine how this person would act in a certain situation. And that helps us, particularly when it is for products that are a little bit out in the future, where we are dealing with a slightly future context and not where we are now. And then many times we try to very quickly prototype something, have some kind of tangible thing that we can then put in front of people and actually have them try to use this or give reaction in focus groups or usability testing sessions, one-on-one interviews, to make sure that the assumptions that we made based on sort of initial research and observation, that we hit the right points. But also many times once you put something in front of people, then they also come back with new reactions or things that you didn't maybe observe before or didn't notice before or they didn't tell you before. But once you have something concrete to react to, it's really a wealth of information that then feeds back into sort of next iteration of development.
Yeah. Right, right.
Many years ago, the English train system decided to put new chairs on their trains. They had the advice of human factors engineers, which are mainly expressed today as ergonomicists. And they set up a system in which they put in the different train cars alternate chairs. They also set up cameras that were known as time-lapse cameras. They took a frame on a moving picture film every 10 or 20 seconds. And these were focused through on the riders through an entire trip. At the end of the trip, you could play this stop frame system back so that 4-hour train trip you could see in 10 minutes. And what you saw was the amount of movement that a person did in their chair, you know, and all this. Now, a trained person who understands the dynamics of sitting in the human body could read from that whether the chair was satisfying the needs of comfort or not. And it provided, perhaps you could say, an observation, like you're saying, which is a legitimate way of analyzing things, and could tell you what was wrong. If you understood sitting, you'd understand whether the seat was too deep, whether there was no back support, whether the arms were too high or too low, and the analysis was a lot closer to reality than if you had, say, taken the passengers and given them a checklist or asked them questions, because they really don't know what they did. This is called unobtrusive measures. And unobtrusive measures are such that you can measure the behavior of people without their knowing. And this is very important.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think a lot of those techniques are lost in...
Or not used.
Or not used in a lot of current design projects.
Why is that so?
Well, you know, whenever anyone asks me what about a problem in design, I blame marketing people. So let me not try to do that here. But
I think you just did.
And if that doesn't work, try the CEO.
Yeah,
he's always responsible.
Yeah, I'll try the CEO. Yeah. But I actually feel that you know there's a lot of opportunity for design-based research. But many design groups are borrowing techniques from marketing groups. Mm-hmm. Marketing and design are not the same. Marketing groups fund a lot of design work, and it's very easy to cooperate because marketing groups often fund the budget. But I'm not sure marketing groups, for instance, would, you know, they would, you know, in my experience, they would more readily sponsor or conceive a survey as opposed to a time-lapse video. Mm-hmm. You know, which is fine for marketing, right? But you know, may not be fine for design, or may not be appropriate for design. So the good news is there's so much opportunity still for designers to develop research techniques and implement and use them, or revive them, or bring them back into the design process, and learn a lot from it.
I mean, do you want to elaborate on that by talking about biomechanics at all?
Well, you know, most biomechanics is physically the way your body works. Most people, designers, don't really know how the body works. Don't even know how their hand works necessarily, because you know I teach a lot of schools and guest lecture, and am involved in a lot of design projects, and I will tell you that. I'll do a survey that I'll do it with you. Some people here may have seen it before. My finger will bend in 3 places. First place it'll bend is here, right? Where's the second place it'll bend? Right? Third place it'll bend? Right? Everyone agree? No.
Not sure?
No. My finger doesn't bend here. My finger bends here. If I show you this scene, right, go like that. Now, you've all had your hands a very long time. But if you look at your hands, you'll realize that your finger does not bend there at all. It's actually the middle of the bone. And most designers don't think of that, even if they're designing hand tools. I mean, you know, they won't reflect that back. Now, I know what you're thinking. If my finger bends here, here, and here, what the hell is this? It has function. But again, it would be great if you're designing something that you're touching to design it up to the shoulder, which means, again, it's design is about the person, know how the thing works, but also know how the system works, at least up to the shoulder.
I'd like to comment on that to the degree that when you watch people do something with their hands, you get entirely different feedback than somebody who hasn't studied the hand. Mm-hmm. And this is where observation really counts, is that it's enlightened observation. I've designed enough chairs to know that just watching somebody sit in a chair, I can tell them almost directly what it is that's not a good fit, because I know what those movements amount to. If somebody slides forward gradually in their chair, it's because the back is not providing the right support. If they go arm to arm, side to side, it means the armrests are not at the right height. And any number of things like that, if you're aware of them, like you said in the hand, you become an enlightened observer. That becomes more than just casual observing.
This also makes me think of the strategy of designing for the extremes, and like somebody with arthritis. And can you talk about thinking about, and that's different from something like the Liberty chair, where the extremes, the super extremes, can't sit in it, right? The extremes are out of the equation. It's the broad center. Are these two different ways of designing? You understand what I'm saying, the question?
Refine your style.
Well, let's start with Dan and talking about the idea of designing for extreme needs, and then we can move on to
Yeah.
Well, my simplest description is that if you design a doorway for the average person, half the people will bump their heads. So you don't want to do that. There is actually a lot of opportunity at the extremes. At these corner cases. And extreme may not be something about ability. Extreme may just be situational. Like we know when we design the interface for the hybrid that there are some people who are called hypermilers. They are just intent on getting the most mileage that they possibly can. We also know every once in a while they're late for the airport and they just have to floor that sucker, right? Mileage out the window. And it's situational. It's not personality based. There is a lot of opportunity and a lot of information and innovation that you can extract from weak signals. Again, a vote for design research, because I think doing this observation that Niels is talking about and then Sigi does, I think if you're a designer on site, on the field, you don't want to average stuff. We often, we'll talk to 20 people. One person would say something. We go back to, to the ranch. And we'd say, oh, this person mentioned this. And you can take 2 points of view, where you can say, well, that's only 1 out of 20 people who said that. Or you can say, wow, we nailed it. That one person, let's act on it. And I think we tend a little bit more to put a lot of credence in that one thing that one person may have said, because they may have had an excellent point. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You won't get that if you average the answers. You only get that if you look at the individuals.
Well, averaging is what the marketing people do.
Right. That's
add up the numbers.
The focus group.
Add up the numbers. It's an unfortunate aspect of the marketers is they get the numbers from ersatz beginnings, and then they hand numbers to a professional financier running the company, and they understand the numbers, so they think it must be good. And of course, there's so much about human behavior that you can't put numbers to. You've got to add it you've got to transfer it through many other means.
Yeah, and I think that's probably okay for marketing, but not great for designers to adopt. So, a lot of consumer research traditionally has emanated from marketing groups. As a matter of fact, when I was talking, when we started design, and in the 70s, there was very little design research going on. When we started working, and we told companies we wanted to go out in the field, they said, that's not your job, that's our marketing job. It's a very hard sell to many companies that designers should actually get out of the office and go out into the field, because we started writing project plans where we would say, we're going to do marketing research. Now that didn't fly at all, because we're the design group, right? So let's change that word. And then we said, well, we have to go out in the field, we're designers, we're going to do consumer research. And that didn't work because that was still too, it was stepping on toes, right? We do the market consumer research. Then we realized that we could use a phrase called design research, and it starts with the word design, and they can't come back and say, we do design research, because they're not the designers, right? So we actually and we're probably not the first people to use the word design research, but it worked much better, and it sounded like a thing that designers should be doing, and in fact it was a thing, and it was much easier to phrase it that way and explain why we wanted to go out in the field and do the things. But I still think there's so much opportunity for designers to actually improve and develop methods and use these methods to learn from. In biomechanics, time-lapse photography, psychology, perception, usability studies are still, I think, just scratching the surface.
And yeah, I think another point that's really important is how the research is interpreted afterwards. And you've already hinted at that maybe even if 20 people say one thing and only one person says something else, that may still be an incredibly valuable comment. And we always feel a little bit some tensions, I mean, not always, but with some clients, there's some tension when it comes to usability testing. And then we always make sure that we are there when that happens, so that we can really observe with our own eyes what's happening, because between what somebody writes down afterwards in the report, maybe the researcher in charge who is leading the moderating discussions and things like that, between what they write and what we actually see and pick up, what people do, because what gets down very often is what people say, but what they say is not necessarily the same as what they do or what you observe them doing and see. So it's really important to participate and to really watch these usability tests, and then also be very careful about this kind of interpretation if it's not done by you, but by somebody else, because these reports go on to the marketing people or other people who then, again, just look at the numbers and say, but this idea we should throw out because nobody liked it. When in fact, it was not necessarily that people didn't like it. There were certain comments or certain things that you could easily remedy, and then it would turn the whole judgment around. So I think interpreting research and how the research is being used, I think that's something that needs to be done very carefully.
Well, most people like what they're familiar with, too. And if you come up with something different, the first reaction is often that they're suspicious of it. You won't get a good reaction. I remember telling clients in the past that a design is something that most people didn't like. I said, well, if they liked it, it would just be just like what they've got already. I said, if it's going to be anything new or different or better, it's got to be something they're not familiar with. There's often a lot of refusal in new things. But the part that I find of deep interest to me is the fact that we nowadays, in what we do, which we call, I guess, industrial designers. Are you both calling yourself industrial designers, more or less?
I usually say product design.
Product design.
Yeah.
You see what I meant about nobody knows what design is? There's no one term that makes it all different. But this museum grows out of a history, out of a past that dealt with what was known as decorative arts. And decorative arts are things that are useful to some degree, but also artistic. And generally speaking, they were relatively first-order magnitude functional items, dishes and silverware and tables and chairs and wallpaper and things. And that falls in the category of decorative arts. However, if you start adding any degree of functionality, something that has the potential to serve a broader purpose, then you begin to take yourself out of that category. And not only a museum, not that I'm saying this museum isn't aware of things that go beyond the old-fashioned decorative arts theme, but that you fall into Never Never Land as far as the evaluation by people who both show the products and publish about them in the media. It's very hard for the media, in any case, to be very critical about products that are more than decorative arts, because that puts a challenge to them that they have to evaluate the function. Now, I'm using the term function to mean how well does it work for those who will use it. The function is serving the person, not how the gears work and the electrons race around, but does it serve its need? Well, evaluating that takes a bit more depth and a bit more understanding than just how does it look. And yet most of our media and most of our display of design is largely focused on the decorative art aspect of it, the appearance. How does it look? And yet what we're talking about goes way beyond that. Not just what we're saying, but the potential of what we're saying.
Yeah, although I would say that there sure are a lot of gadget blogs that go pretty in-depth about about function in this day and age, you know, how something works, perhaps above and beyond how it looks.
Well, it's a lot of talk.
But you don't think it
tells you anything of substance.
But you know this is a very interesting topic, because I have always thought of museums as archivists. Until recently, I've had some conversations with a couple of curators at museums that have design collections, and had conversations prompted by them is that they have exhibits that are much more popular when those exhibits are socially relevant. In other words, relevant to the community. And you know, when I was, you know, growing up as a designer, the greatest honor you could have would to be in a design museum, right? Have your work selected, and you know, like you're saying, it was basically the school of thought there is decorative arts. So there's a lot of attention to visual aspects of design, as opposed to, you know, maybe functional, human, or usability aspects of design, or even other forms of social responsibility. What happens now if museums turn around and say, we're going to focus on design that's socially responsible? And there have been exhibits, like the SAFE exhibit, or the, you know, others that actually. Yeah. So now, what happens now if museums actually start honoring these projects or products or systems or services that portray some form of social responsibility? Can museums actually lead the parade? And I've never thought of museums in that way before. I always thought of museums as archivists, not as...
But so to connect to something Niels was talking about earlier, encouraging museums to promote accountability amongst designers. I mean, that's a function that you're proposing for institutions like this one.
Yeah, and you know, not easy, because you know, museums have long histories, you know, and like Niels was saying, they do what they know, or you know, do what they're comfortable, or do what worked in the past. But it would be very interesting, and I believe there are curators out there who have that in their sights. The idea of actually honoring or encouraging, or for two reasons. One is because, well, the main reason is because they get business. You know, they get visibility. They get people into the museums. You know, they get traffic, right? Which is, you know, right. Basically they get income for the museum. It's very popular. They're finding that those socially relevant shows are popular.
Well, go ahead.
This is sort of tangential to what you're saying, but I think it applies that over the years there has been invitations put out to the design community for established designers to name the most important designs they know, those designs which they think they're most seriously good. And I've collected these. I've got at least 6 or 8 of these, going back 20, 30 years. The interesting thing about it is that I would say of the items named, from designers up to a number of, say, a couple dozen different established designers, 75% of the items named were not designed by designers. They were either generic, like a paperclip or a Franklin stove, or they were designed by engineers, like an airplane or a boat or a no, I said Franklin stove. Anyway, items that were not a product of those of us who call ourselves designers. And I'll add to that by saying that a couple of automobiles that we all know were done and have become icons. One was the Volkswagen Beetle, and the other was the Mini. And now they've been reproduced in modern form, having in the conversion lost a lot of the basic usefulness that they had in the first place, but were so revered in their original form that they have now warranted a reproduction with all the effort of the stylists and everything else to make them very sleek and desirable. But people tend to forget that the original cars weren't even designed by designers. They were designed by engineers. They were designed on the basis of performance. They were designed to be efficient and to perform well and do the most with the least amount of materials and complication. So what is the measure of design? If some of our best designs come from sources that don't hew to the traditional measure of designing for the way things look, why are we bothering with the way things look? Why don't we just do a better job at the way they work, and they'll come out looking pretty good?
Maybe this socially responsible stuff has something to do with, or could have something to do with it. I mean,
it's a part of the same thing.
Think about, I mean, what, if you could, what designers can do or how they should be thinking about behavior, and not just fulfilling needs, but actually changing behavioral patterns amongst consumers. I mean, that's something that you've all done in your work to a certain degree. How do you go about thinking about those kinds of things?
I just want to interrupt, just follow up on this.
Sure.
But I do also think that, for example, the engineers who designed the Volkswagen or the Mini, they also did make their decisions based on aesthetics as well. I don't think it was just, sometimes there are very talented engineers who also have a good sense of aesthetics.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point, in that engineers weren't always the klutzes they are now. That they had an aesthetic nature. I mean, you can go all the way back to Isambard Kingdom Brunel in England, who was doing the early railroads and the trains and the early ships and all that. They made the aesthetic decisions, and they weren't always so bad. No, I think that's a very interesting issue. And you know what I think has happened in the interim is they became specialists.
Right.
They became focused on evaluating numerical quotients of success instead of using their aesthetic nature, their cultural capabilities.
So an effective designer is a generalist.
I'm glad you said that.
Oh.
Well, that's true. I think that is at the core.
A student of many disciplines and a jack of all trades.
That's the core of the whole thing. Design is the only generalist activity left. Everything else is specialization.
Would either of you care to respond to that? Then we'll get back to the socially responsible stuff.
It's a bit of a provocative statement.
Yeah. We agree that all
tough
questions go to Sigi first.
What was the question?
It's the only generalist trade
design
there is.
The only generalist activity operable.
Yeah, I mean, a designer needs to have really a very broad knowledge and has to be a good generalist. But at the same time, you also have to have specialist knowledge. And I think that's what, in a way, makes it very difficult to be a good designer, because you cannot only be the generalist.
But specialists of how many specialties?
That's...
You're immediately a generalist.
We sometimes have a lot of success by making connections between things we see in very diverse categories, product categories. You know, something we see in medical may relate to something we do in a kitchen product or the other way around. So being that generalist, in a way, puts design in a unique position, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It is that ability to make those connections, which is, you know, a valuable, you know, can lead to innovation. So and that is, I don't want to say it's a learned skill, but it's valuable to be able to see how different things that people do out in the world, again, I'll like refer this back to people, not things, how something that somebody may do at home can relate to how like a radiologist does his or her work, you know, or maybe how something works in the hardware store relates to how something should work in the office, you know, whether it's a mechanism that does something, or a sound, or an interface, or something. So having that wide view, you know, assuming you're a designer who touches many, many different categories, can be very valuable. And valuable to companies who tend to be focused on one thing at a time, because they don't always have that spectrum to draw from.
My old boss, Henry Dreyfuss, as I said, was one of the founders of the activity of industrial design in this country. When he started his practice in the late 20s, early 30s, he inevitably reported to the president of the company. The president was, in effect, the operative generalist of the organization. He had to know, or she, of course, in those days, most of them were he's, about the manufacturing aspect, about the financial end of it, about running the company efficiently, and so on and so on. So they were expected to be the generalist major domo over the whole thing. And of course, the designer and this person could communicate quite readily, because it was about the whole picture, not one thing. Today, the CEOs are financial specialists, most of them. You've got a Steve Jobs here and there, and those who can and do break the mold and become generalists and know enough about it, the whole picture, to bring together and proportion the emphasis from each of the separate disciplines involved to the degree it makes a refined product. But there aren't many anymore. This has all evolved, and it's changed tremendously over the years in that things have gotten complicated, and everybody thinks the more complicated it gets, the more you have to understand it in depth. They forget that the product itself doesn't exist in that depth. It exists in the panoply of this whole combination of influences. You can't define anything through one specialty. An old friend of mine named Howard Gossage, a really broad-minded advertising guy, said to me once, if you go to an architect with a problem, all he can give you an answer is a building. What you may need is a divorce. So you cannot count on a problem solution from a specialist. At least a problem solution that is of benefit to the broader aspects of civilization.
I want, if I may, to go back to this question of social responsibility. And I want to ask you guys if you think it's part of a designer's job to promote more like socially sustainable forms of behavior. I mean, is it something that should consciously be a part of the designer's toolkit? And if so, what are the elements of that strategy? I mean, the Ford dashboard is one example that you could probably point to, Dan. I don't know if either of you would like to respond to that question as well.
Do one thing for
Sure.
me. What did you say? Sustainability?
Well, social sustainability, social responsibility.
Could you explain what that means?
To get consumers to behave in ways that are better for themselves, if it has to do with, like, designing products that discourage obesity. Well, I think that we're getting onto a slippery slope here.
Okay, good. Sorry, I just wanted to, because that means something different to everyone.
No, designing products that allow consumers to treat themselves better, treat others better, and treat the planet better.
Well, Well, you know, you had a picture of the syringe that we designed a while ago. When we designed the syringe, and when we designed the packaging, also for the syringe, which was a little bit of a separate project, we set our goal not at the syringe and not as the package, but we set our goal as being compliance. Our goal in the package and the syringe is not to design the syringe necessarily, or not to design a box that holds these syringes. We set our goal as we need to get that medication into somebody's body. And once you set that as the goal, the discussions back at the ranch are a bit different. You know, you do your design editing and your design thinking, and your ideas are coming from a different perspective, a wider perspective. And you can actually, you know, as you know, design is powerful, and I think there's probably a lot of designers here who realize that design can and will affect behavior. And what is very important to do is establish your goal early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's actually one of the key roles of design is, I think, to change people's behavior. And particularly, I think in our contemporary time, there are a lot of things that should be changed. A lot of behaviors should be made more healthy. I mean, starting from physical health, if you are looking at the kind of obesity rates in this country, it's a time bomb. And financial health, if you look, again, another time bomb. If you look at environmental health, all these aspects require a change in behavior. Of course, as a designer, we are trying to make products that are more environmentally sustainable or socially sustainable. But I think that the big thing is also we need to change our lifestyle. And I think through design, we can help with that.
Let's talk about environmental sustainability for a second. I mean, is it a difficult challenge to balance those questions with core usability concerns? I mean, your latest chair is an example of a product that does that, I think. But how do you go about thinking that when you're
Well, I never
designing?
think about environmental sustainability.
Okay.
I think about efficiency.
Uh-huh.
I think about how do you do a product that uses the least material possible, satisfies the need in the simplest way, is the lowest cost, is successful in its accommodation to the human being. If you answer all those questions in any depth, you've taken into account sustainability. The latest chair I've done, which is on display here, uses half the number of parts of any other comparable chair. It's half the weight. It's simplified to a huge degree. It's not by stroke of brilliance, I tell you, because it's taken me years to work up to this point. But the thing about it is that I didn't give one thought to design, environmental sustainability. My only objective was to be efficient. And efficiency, taken to its extremes, means you do the absolute most for the least. And that encounters it. For instance, even if I used all the wrong materials in the chair, I've only got half the amount there. So I'm already way ahead of everybody else. You know, it could all be bad stuff, but it wouldn't mean anything because there's so little of it.
Well, you know, when we designed the scrubs that you saw, and you could tell I have a hard time talking without slides because I'm still pointing at it. Well, you know, the scrubs that you saw, right, the visual, right. We realized that we should think of scrubs. This is what every hospital worker wears on a daily basis. Rather than a commodity low-cost item, which were literally reduced by many manufacturers to like an envelope, a little cutout envelope that people are wearing, we said let's think about it in terms of performance wear, so that you know you can move and be comfortable and you're not tripping over your cuffs, things like that. When we looked at and of course we're using some materials and some cuts and you know like patterns that are more expensive than the envelope, but we looked at the entire system and we realized that the entire system includes washing, drying, and durability. You know, how often do you need to throw away your scrubs because they're worn out? So we used the material that was more durable, was able to be washed at lower temperatures, and dried much more quickly. So when you look not just at the scrubs, but the entire system, now you can sell a hospital on this idea that here, buy our scrubs. They are a little premium priced compared to what you've been buying. But when you look at the entire picture, and that gives us permission, by thinking that way, that gives us permission to do some nice design work because we, save.
But ultimately, it's the same logic as Niels. You're increasing efficiency, and out of that falls environmental
sustainability. Yeah, it's by thinking about the big picture.
Yeah, there's another thing going on here, and that is the three of us are in the activity we do because we're inclined that way. We have a temperament that makes us see, for one thing, a more generalized view of things. Also, there's something that I, for perhaps lack of a better term, that I call the aesthetic attitude. The aesthetic attitude is such that you can be sensitive to doing things that give a little more joy than just satisfying the basics, that adds something more. And aesthetics, as I said earlier, is largely thought of as how it looks, but it's a lot more than that. It's the sensitivity. Why is a French cheese better than a supermarket cheese? Why is a suit of clothes by a couturier better than one bought off the rack or something? It's this intangible aspect. And to me, this gets to the crux of what utilitarian design is all about, is how do you serve these basic needs that Dan and Sigi are talking about, that people need just to function, and then add that something extra, something that gives them a benefit beyond just plain function, that is a fundamental function. And I think, you have to treat folks like us very carefully and be kind to us, because we can't always explain why we do things. And yet, as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of what makes life worth living, is it goes a little further, does something more than just the basic, everyday, dry activity.
Sigi, did you want to speak to the environmental question?
Yeah, the one point I wanted to make is that, as I said, I think that it is also necessary to change lifestyles. For example, yes, we can make a water bottle that's recyclable or reusable or whatever, but I think we should question behaviors more fundamentally. Well, do we really need to buy bottled water? And so if we can come up with incentives to change people's behavior, and in fact, instead of doing what is maybe the most convenient, we make that which may not be as convenient, but ultimately much better and sustainable. How can we make that attractive and desirable? And I think that's really where design has to come in helping us make these lifestyle changes. Because it's not just about buying the green product versus the other product. I think it's really a much bigger issue.
Well, let me ask one more question, and we'll turn it over to you out there. But thinking about incentives, we were talking earlier about the role that the museum could play in encouraging socially responsible design. What about the biggest institution of them all, the U.S. government, or public policy? What, if any, role could or should public policy be playing in the question of national design policy? Is something that's been discussed at great length. Is there a role there for government to encourage socially responsible, socially sustainable, environmentally sustainable forms of design?
I think so. I mean, of course. In general, we need policy to make certain things happen. Ideally, we make it just happen by design. Mm-hmm. But sometimes we need the help from policy. And if together with certain policy experts, if we were to develop things such as products that everybody gets to to give them feedback about their consumption of, again, let's say water. I mean, how often do we turn on our faucet and have no clue actually how much water are we consuming every day? If there is a feedback mechanism that tells us what we're doing, then we have something very concrete that can help change our behavior. But if that's only left to those people who are maybe a little bit more enlightened to get such devices, then we don't reach a critical mass. And sometimes to reach a critical mass, we need also some policy to say, well, we should all do that so that we can all together make a difference.
Yeah, and I think the initial reaction is, oh God, get government involved. But there are things that are government regulated, like food labeling. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of reaction against that initially. It's probably not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Environmental controls, pollution controls. New York City itself used to be a sea of smog in the 60s and 70s. It is not beautiful out there, but it's much more cleaned up. It really used to be a purple haze in the morning, most mornings, when there's a lot of manufacturing.
Is that just because of the smog, or was it the times you were living in?
It's my view from New Jersey was affected by many things. One was the weather. One of them was the weather.
But yeah, wouldn't it be great, for example, speaking about food labeling, if there was also some information about the carbon footprint of the food that you're buying, so that you would know, oh, maybe if you have the bananas here and the apples here, and then you suddenly can make a much more informed judgment. Well, is it really worth for me to have, or let's say, strawberries in winter when they come from the other part of the world? Is it really worth for me to make this necessary, this big carbon footprint? Do I really want these strawberries so much? I mean, I don't say that everybody needs to become a monk, but we should be able to sort of make more informed decision. What's worth doing, what's worth consuming, and where could I easily swap that with something else that's not as harmful? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
that's an issue in our house. Helena, my wife, who's Swedish, says, why are you buying those strawberries? They come from all the way from Chile. Each strawberry is coated in carbon from the trip, and we ought to feel guilty. Swedes feel guilty very readily. And I say, well, I think it's nice to have things that we shouldn't have now and then, because it makes you feel special. But the worst of it is, well, I shouldn't say the worst of it, but beyond what we're saying, all of which is obviously something that it would be nice to do better than to have a 747 flying all the way from Chile with strawberries in it, just for us. But on the other hand, if you didn't have the ability to ship things around, you'd have a pretty dull diet. If you were living off local produce, it would be pretty limited, as the pioneers knew. And I grew up on a Mississippi farm, and I can tell you that everything you grew in the summer and every animal you slaughtered in the summer, your biggest concern was, how do we have this same thing through the winter? And of course, you did a lot of canning, putting things up in jars. You did a lot of smoking. You did a lot of salting. You did a lot of things that tried to preserve the stuff. Well, all of this shipping around is just a modern day equivalent of what we've always tried to do, is to have stuff year-round that equated to a good diet. But I think much more consequential, and yet at the same time more insidious, is the fact that one of the biggest design programs carried on in this country is the design of food. I'm not talking about just the packaged stuff. All the fresh stuff you get has been designed. One way or another, it's been designed and genetically altered in order to provide the growers and the shippers with something that would accommodate the process of getting that stuff to you without it being rotted or bashed or whatever. And I've lived long enough to know that the things you buy in the market are not the things that we had 50 years ago. They've all been changed. You cannot get a peach, a grape, an apple, a pear, any of those things. You cannot get them the way they were 50 years ago. They are a different product. I often think that they are a form of plastic, that a number of them have been injection molded out of polyurethane foam and other items too fierce to mention.
Natural flavors.
Yeah, with natural flavors added. So the design, even the design of food is open to some consideration for improvement.
On that note, why don't we open it up to you guys? There's a mic that's going to come around, so anybody with a question want to raise their hand? Let's start in the front.
It's fine, okay. Okay, hi. So I go to a school that does a lot of design research, and maybe this is a question for Sigi. And so...
It's a cell phone.
Yeah. Oh, probably mine. So we do a lot of research, and then we spend
I'll get it. Yeah.
Oh, we hear you.
So, and then we spend a significant amount of time analyzing it. So we'll do like 2x2s and clusters and personas and insight matrices. And we do it so we can break down this problem and sort of see it differently and build it back up again. But I've started to worry recently that we're falling prey to narrative fallacy, because my desire to make sense out of these stories and build a story out of these disparate observations is maybe bigger than the actual kind of meaning, actual reality of these stories. So I guess it's a two-part question. One is like, is that an issue for you? Do you feel like sometimes you've built a story around a subway commuter's life, and suddenly you're going like, I don't know if I've made this up. I don't know if I've put too many things together. And two, like, even if you do that, like, maybe that's not even a problem.
Big question.
Well, for example, in environments where we can very well study existing users, then we wouldn't make these storyboard scenarios. Which technique to use really depends on the project and what is involved, what is at stake. And yes, when you work on a very hypothetical thing or something that's not very clear defined, because you are making these storyboards in order to be able to define something more concrete, then yes, sometimes you can get maybe a little bit carried away. But I think it's also a matter of practice. Once you do more and more, you know how to trim and where really things are that are relevant and where there are things that suddenly become self-serving, because ultimately it's not about making a storyboard. You're not making a movie or anything. It's just a way to help you think and brainstorm or ideate. And when you see it isn't leading anywhere, it isn't helpful, then you won't go that avenue. So I think I wouldn't be worried. I think that's typical of school, that things go very much like according to a protocol, and maybe too far, then in real life it figures itself out.
Well, we've got an approach where we actually design for real people, with the idea that there are 6 billion people in the world. You don't have to make up another one. And in doing that, even with a small cluster of real people, you get a very interesting reality check. If you invent an ideal, an average, or a persona, they seem to be your imaginary friend that likes everything you do. So, I've never been to a meeting where someone has been talking to me about a persona. A design team has been talking about they designed for this persona, but we showed this to our persona thought it sucked. Right? No, that never happens. The persona is always very
you need to build that into your persona.
You've got to build it, exactly, right.
You always have to have something really annoying about your persona.
Yeah, your persona really has to be in a real pissy mood some days, right? But that happens. It does happen with real people. Real people are situational. So actually, it's very interesting to focus on real people because an average is just one imaginary person. Even though you think it represents a lot of people, so do you represent a lot of people, and so does the 6 people behind you represent a lot of people. And I'll tell you, it's actually difficult. If you look at the 6 people immediately around you, it's really difficult to design one product that they're all going to love. So it's not an easy challenge to design for real people. It's easy, I think, to design for an average person, but I don't think it's easy to design for real people. So it really puts you on your guard. I mean, it really puts you on, you have to be sharp to do that.
So I can see your faces.
We'll take the front and then the back. Back first. Oh, back and then the front. Sorry.
Okay. To me, I've kind of taken two of the themes tonight that I've noticed seem to have been obviously user-centered design and then a social aspect. And I'm wondering if those two things walk hand in hand or they contradict each other. And if they do walk hand in hand, how do you balance them? Because one to me seems to be addressing existing activities or the way that the user interacts with life. And then the social aspect seems to be addressing something, promoting an activity or a behavior. So in my mind, there's one's addressing an existing activity, and then another is promoting a future one. And do they contradict each other? Does that question make sense, or do they walk hand in hand?
I think ultimately they need to be, or they are walking hand in hand, because if in the bigger picture we are destroying ourselves, then that's not user-centered. If you take a sort of short-term view, yes, you may introduce something that's suddenly less convenient. Let's say you cannot, lots of disposable stuff now, you're not allowed to have this anymore. But disposable things are easy, so you could say it's sort of very user-centered because you don't need to wash the dishes, you just throw everything away, if you have that very narrow definition of user-centeredness or user-friendliness. But in the bigger picture, it's not sustainable. So ultimately, it's not going to in the end, it will work against you. So
our children are going to be users too.
Yeah, so if you look at the big picture, I think they need to go hand in hand, or they are going hand in hand. They're not contradictory.
Was there somebody in the front?
Yeah, okay, great. This is a question for Sigi and Designing for the Extreme. I'm a graphic designer and a former subway graffiti artist, and I was curious, I've been fascinated by the technology used to deter people like myself from vandalizing subway trains. I'm retired now, obviously.
Bring in the officer over there with
Was that one of your character studies for when you were designing the subway trains here in New York City?
Well, we didn't make character studies for the subway, but I mean, of course, that was something that we had to take into consideration. That we use materials that where graffiti will not stick, and of course, as a graffiti tagger, you might be disappointed because for you this was a canvas that you had before. But I think there's also there has been a big shift when you look back. When there was a time where graffiti was really big in New York, it was also a time when the subway was really in a very bad condition. And at that time, it actually added something positive, I would say, to have graffiti on the trains, because that was sort of the only human aspect about it, and people were scared to go in there. But during the 90s, this has changed a lot, and the subway system was cleaned up. And suddenly, when you have a new set of cars, then of course the desire is to keep them clean and keep them nice. Because one thing that happens is if people start making some kind of, I don't want to say damage, but some sort of vandalism, it has a kind of chain effect. Once you see something looks like it's not being cared for, then more people will become careless, and people won't worry about throwing stuff away, or it will encourage more vandalism. So it is sort of important to keep it up and keep it clean. And I think maybe there are other places now where graffiti is more appropriate, and I don't think it's the train anymore.
Thank you. I have found this discussion extremely stimulating and thought-provoking, and I thank you. Not a lot has been said about educating the public thus far. I find David Pogue's analyses of technology very helpful, but even then there's no substitute for an individual evaluating their own circumstances. His situation and his needs may be different from the reader's. And what, in your view, would you mind saying a few words of what might stimulate sort of self-education on the part of the public about design? I know that Cooper-Hewitt does a great deal in that regard. I just wondered if you had any thoughts.
I would have a thought related to maybe an even bigger picture of how branding has changed. You know, branding was a very hot topic in the 1980s and 90s, and it's going, even early 2000s, and it's going through it's at a crossroads, because branding is no longer what a company says it is. Branding is what people say your company is. And the reason is, where you used to rely on a brand for a purchase, like Nikon or Sony or whoever you would purchase, you no longer need to rely on that brand name to make a purchase, because you can go to the internet, see what other people are saying about a product from a company you may or may not know, and literally if you see 200 positive reviews, you will have courage and confidence to buy and try that product. It puts companies in a very interesting situation for two reasons. One is that new companies can come out of nowhere and become popular very quickly. New brands, new companies, new products. But it also means that a company can no longer fall back on brand to sell products. Their design and the experience of using that design for everybody needs to be needs to work at a very high level.
What I've noticed is that the designer's best communication about enlightening the public, if you will, is just to do good design. If designers were all working towards the same useful goals of providing good products, the public would, as a result, be educated, because they'd soon find out that the things that worked better and they could buy at a good price and look good was the best way to go. So that, in a way, I think this is probably our best avenue. But then the other aspect of it, of course, is the fact that, again, getting back to the media, we've got to count on people who are communicating about design to show a broader outlook in how they evaluate what is good. And a lot of the stuff they show is just trendy and is there to seduce you into buying it. And it isn't necessarily good.
Hi, I'm a design student, actually. And I was wondering about your calling design not a profession. And I guess I agree with you, because I see it, I guess, as more of a calling than a profession. But I was wondering, you said that you didn't call it a profession because you didn't see the accountability in it. And I was wondering if the accountability could be improving the quality of life, and if it could be measured by, as Sigi and Dan were saying, by time and the changing of behavior. Like, so there's time, right? And then there's, over time, behavior changes, and that's how you can measure, like, the improvements in the quality of life, and if that could be the accountability for design.
Yeah, but who would do that? I mean, who would measure?
Well, your subway system, right?
Mm-hmm.
If there's, over time, more people use the subway,
mm-hmm.
right? So whether they really loved it or not, it changed behavior. And it changed kind of class structure too, right? But the way that people were able to transport and move themselves, right? So, and that happened over time. That couldn't be necessarily, I mean, you couldn't measure that on paper, but I guess it takes longer.
Yeah, I mean, my response basically is that I think it is very hard to measure. And
right.
Yeah, who would be the system? Is there who would be the authority to do the measurement? Who would be the agency that does that? I think that's sort of the problem. And for example, if you take the subway, yes, ridership went up, but I also cannot claim credit, or we cannot claim credit for that just because of the design. I mean, there's everything we design exists within a larger ecosystem, and all the different bits and pieces fall into that too. How a product is marketed, how it is distributed, how it is maintained, what kind of warranty you have, what kind of price you have. All of this goes together. And so it's actually really hard to sort of pull out, well, what was now really the achievement of the design versus all this other stuff.
It is possible to measure this, what you're talking about. And time, obviously, is a factor.
Yeah.
If a drug company puts out a pill, they have to wait till it runs through several stages with animals and people. If they don't knock off too many people, then it's okay. So it takes time. And in the same way, that's the way most research goes. But there are techniques available. I wrote a publication many years ago called The Design of Experience, and in which I enumerated and showed examples of, I don't know, a couple hundred different techniques used to evaluate the behavior and the outcome of experience of people in different situations or with different things. If there was a way to pull together a laboratory of human experience in which all these techniques could be pulled together, not for the benefit of the specialists who may have invented them separately, but for amalgamating them into one testing routine that would apply itself to both in vitro and what's the opposite of in vitro? In real life testing. You could learn an awful lot about people. And it isn't, what I found is you don't get the final answer. What you do is enlighten yourself. It's what you were saying earlier. You learn from the various tests enough so that you can make an enlightened judgment in what's the best way to proceed. But there is a way. There are ways to doing this. But who backs it? What was being said? Where's the force to do this? We've got an educational program coming out of Washington now that is to raise the intelligence of our students. What are they focusing on? Mathematics, physics, all of these technical things. That's only half of life. They haven't said anything about improving the art programs anywhere. They haven't said anything about making people understand design and how it plays a role in their life. And yet that's what forms the quality of your life.
But Dan, I'll ask isn't that really behavior economics? And isn't it really the decision and the study about how we make decisions about money and going back to the consumer? And that's the ultimate decision. It is about, there is a one way of saying that, and that's behavior economics. How we decide to buy what we decide, and when we decide to spend money, and when we decide to save money.
Well, I think one of the tricks with design, and it'd be great, for all of us probably in terms of income if we could actually measure it, but it's very intangible to measure the outcome of design. I mean, there are a lot of factors that you can gauge design by, and a lot of people do. Certainly, you can point to companies, for instance, that have great customer service, and you can track their stock, and it's may not be doing that bad, right, as a whole. There are ways to gauge it, but there's not a great way to put, always a great way. Maybe there's fashion in some other fields, but in product design, there's not always a great way to put a number on that design to totally quantify it, which is kind of too bad and kind of okay.
There's also all those unintended consequences that you're never too sure of what down the road is going to happen.
Yeah.
Time for one more question? Sorry, in the back.
Is this on? There you go. Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm an engineer.
Hello, Eric.
Actually, in full disclosure, I'm the director of engineering at Smart Design, and we actually call ourselves design engineers. And I heard some comments earlier about sort of pairing design sort of almost against engineering, and I think we sort of think of engineering within the world of design as sort of more empowering than that, sort of looking at opportunities to take design into places, maybe leveraging technology or mechanisms or what have you to create experiences. And when I think about experiences, I kind of highlight a couple things like, the iPhone, the whole swiping pictures across the screen is this incredible, delightful experience that is both designed and engineered. And I think on the other flip side, I look at a lot of like coffee pots that look like they do what they're supposed to do, hold water, but when you try to pour one, I don't know how they do it, but they manage not to be able to pour properly. So my question to you is in terms of designing experiences for humans. In other words, it's not designing for people as in a static. There was a picture earlier of the subway car with nobody on it. It was sort of odd, right? Subways are moving.
Because it was taken in the shop before it ever went out on the rails.
Right, but in terms of designing that experience a human has with the object or the thing or just the experience in general, maybe you could talk a little about how you use multidisciplinary teams, engineers, designers, interaction designers, communication, whatever, to really create a delightful experience.
The best team is the single individual. Every team tries to replicate one enlightened person. And of course, they throw huge roadblocks in the process because you have to work through several other psychosocial manifestations in a team to make it work. Now, that's not to say they're not necessary because some things are too complicated for any one person to know enough about it. But this is where the generalist comes in. But nevertheless, I think it is important for the team to find a common thread in which they all understand what the objective is. A good manager or CEO or whoever can do this to a team, and it's a rarity. Otherwise, the person with the loudest voice carries the day in some teams, and it's very important. But what I said earlier about engineers, I hope you didn't take as any sort of demeaning comment, because I think all this springs from engineering. I think if there were enlightened engineers as a result of experience and training and what have you, the profession of design would have no reason to exist. Enlightened engineering, culturally aware engineering, is really all you need to have.
Yeah, and let me reference something or back up something that Niels said. There was a study, actually a book written by a group from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute that looked at innovation in the country, like really significant innovations in the country. And in most cases, they traced those innovations to one multidisciplinary individual. And that doesn't mean that one person knew everything, but that one person was able to encompass many, many aspects of the product or service, including engineering, marketing, manufacturing, design, usability, etc. So the concept of a multidisciplinary individual is not a bad thing. And that person, by the way, was usually a troublemaker within the company. Seriously, it was usually someone who, you know, like we said before, you have a good idea. If everyone likes it, it's probably not a good idea. Right? So you really have to, fight to get things done. You really have to, persist.
One last word, if I may. Don't forget, all of you are in control. What you do defines how we all live. What you do defines what we buy, how successful the three of us are. We're not in control. We throw stuff out there and hope for the best, and that we make a living from it. But in reality, it's all of the people that form the consumer society, if you will, that determines how well we all do. So everyone's responsible in this game.
Thanks so much to all of you.